Our ability to freely exercise our religious beliefs has always been protected by the Free Exercise Clause in our First Amendment.
We know vaccine injuries can and will happen. We are just not sure which unlucky child will be next.
And we didn't choose for our children to die for the greater good because of vaccines.
Vaccines save lives. In the past 25 years, almost 1 million lives have been saved in the United States, thanks to vaccines.
This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Matt Dwyer, in for Lucy Nalpathanchil, who's a little under the weather today. You just heard testimony from vaccine opponents and supporters. They spoke back in May on a proposal to end Connecticut's religious exemption to school vaccination requirements. Lawmakers want school children who have claimed a religious objection to vaccines to get the shots or not be allowed to attend school. The proposal failed to advance last session, but it's back this year. Crowds are expected at the state capitol today for a public hearing on that proposal. You can join the conversation on Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Our guests today are Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor of Political Science at Southern Connecticut State University. You can tweet him at PreppyProf. David Collins, columnist at The Day, at David Collins CT, and Mark Pasniokis, Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. You can tweet him at CT Mirror Paz. So we'll kind of actually sort of start off with Mark on the vaccine issue at the state capitol today. So I guess on a basic level, what's caused so many parents to be so upset about this issue?
Well, for the last year and a half or so, there's been a debate at the Capitol about whether or not to eliminate these religious exemptions. The religious exemptions are kind of a misnomer. What we're really talking about is parental choice. There are really no major religions in the world that have a prohibition against vaccines. So what this comes down to are parents who say they should have the right to decide what are done with their children. Now, the state responds, you do have that right, but if you're going to come to public schools, if you're going to be around other children, that you will submit to what there's a great scientific and medical consensus behind is that vaccines are safe and they prevent horrific diseases.
Right. And where are we kind of in the process right now with this public hearing that's going on today? And what kind of a crowd are we expecting at the Capitol today?
The people opposed to mandatory vaccines are incredibly passionate. Polling indicates that they are certainly a distinct minority in Connecticut, if not in the United States. But again, the passion is certainly on their side. I'm sure you're going to see incredibly emotional testimonies today. This is an issue that sort of resonates in a lot of different ways. It goes to what we see in society right now as far as people questioning science, that there isn't the consensus that we used to have as society around a lot of things. You see that in the climate change debate. You see it here. You see it, quite frankly, with an American president who routinely, dismisses institutions such as the Justice Department, such as the National Institutes of Health, and so forth. So, I mean, that's sort of the bigger picture of what we're seeing with this issue.
So, David, I guess some of the parents argue that this is a First Amendment freedom of religion issue. I mean, do you think that's really the issue, or do you think this is more of a medical issue?
That's fine. I accept that if they feel that strongly about it. I feel sorry for their children if they do, and if they're going to deny the science on the matter. But on the other hand, society has a right to protect, and the rest of society has a right to protect their children from the children of these parents who are taking these positions. I feel sorry for the children because they don't have a choice in it, and I think ultimately they would find their way to seeing the importance of being vaccinated.
And I guess for Jonathan, do you think that this is maybe partly kind of a Republican versus Democrat partisan issue?
No, I don't think it is. I think it's probably one dealing with this concern of how much government involvement is necessary, especially as it relates to familial matters. But it is a public health issue, and so that should be at center stage.
And it's unfolding right now. It's unfolding against the backdrop of this worldwide epidemic, and it should really heighten everyone's concern about having unvaccinated children in the school systems.
Right, and we've been seeing this concern in the tri-state area. I mean, obviously in New York, with the cases that have been going on there, from last year and years prior, it's been an issue that just seems not to go away.
It does seem to, and we could touch back at base with Mark again on this, but it does seem like I've seen some kind of breakdown along party lines in this, with the conservative caucus coming out and saying that they felt that this was a freedom of religion issue.
The conservative caucus is an element of the Republican caucus, but it's very small. It's really a handful of folks, and this is bipartisan. It may tilt more towards conservative Republicans, but certainly Jack Hennessy of Bridgeport, a Democrat, is very much involved in this. And this is not something I would really tag the Republican Party with. I mean, there's certainly diversity of opinion in that party. And again, the people who are most animated about this in the Republican Party, they are a distinct minority from what I can tell.
But that's not surprising in any political party, right? You're going to have factions within even a caucus. It typically happens in policy matters. It's just that this is an issue that's clearly being politicized.
And one of the big spokesman of this is Bobby Kennedy Jr. And he came to Hartford last year and spoke, and it was interesting. I mean, his approach wasn't just to take issue with the efficacy and safety of the vaccines, but he launched a broad diatribe against the Centers for Disease Control, the World Health Organization, the American Academy of Pediatrics. And this goes to the point I made at the top, which is this isn't just about vaccines. This is about growing distrust of institutions. And Bobby Kennedy, who, when it comes to climate change, defends the scientific consensus. And I asked him about this. How do you reconcile standing up for science on climate change, and then on the issue of vaccines, you not only urge people to be skeptical and to stay away from them, but you attack every scientific institution, really, because there's unanimity when it comes to the scientific world on this. And he just said, well, scientific consensus by the institutions is not real science. And I didn't know what to respond to that. But that to me is kind of the bigger and almost more interesting element of this. It's sociology, it's politics, it's all of it. And I'm not sure where it goes, this kind of unraveling of the idea that as a society we can reach to a consensus on certain things. Perhaps there'll be differences of opinion about how you tackle certain things. But when you don't have this kind of common language and this common acceptance of what are the facts, we're in a tough spot.
Where do you think that comes from? Is that sort of a matter of people getting their information more from amorphous sources on the internet, or Russian hackers, or something else? Or?
The web, even though I make my living on the web, yes, it's the web allows people who many years ago would sort of there'd be little pockets of doubters, and on the web they can find each other, and for them that's great. The web does amplify misinformation at times. You see it on the web in somebody's Facebook feed. It's all of a piece, whether there are 99 scientists behind one thing and one behind another. It all reads is the same, and it depends on your belief, your level of skepticism. But there is, again, I just can't emphasize enough. I think there is this broader question of how distrustful people are today of many institutions.
It's a very small number of noisy people, though, who are demanding this. And I think you have to kind of remember that. I mean, it's also – and it's not unlike the very small number of people who thought that the Clintons were running prostitution out of a pizza restaurant. I mean, it's sort of – sometimes it becomes even preposterous. But I think, as you said, you're right, it gets amplified on social media. It takes a life on of its own. And I think it gets a kind of a play and a sort of a discussion that probably wouldn't have happened before all the social media and
but the difference here is it does not take many people to destroy the herd immunity that protects our children. Mm-hmm. If you go below 95%, we have a problem. And you have these small communities, some very insular, such as some of the Orthodox Jews in Rockland County. And there's no religious prohibition that for Orthodox Jews not to vaccinate. But it was a sort of a closed community. So they they lost herd immunity there, and that's where the outbreak is. And you see it in some of these other countries or places. I think American Samoa, where the vaccine rate for measles is about 50%, and they have an awful outbreak there. So yeah, I think Dave's absolutely right that this is a small minority, but it can be a small minority that makes a big impact on public health.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Unless we draw the line at the schools, protect our school children, right?
So we'll kind of move on a little bit to the next topic here, which Mark again had. I'll give you a chance to catch your breath here for a moment and get a sip of coffee there. But had breaking news on tolls last night with a story that you wrote. Basically, another toll delay. So like I said, I'll give you a chance to get your breath and go over here to Jonathan. So Jonathan, I guess, why can't they get this thing across the finish line?
I'm absolutely fascinated by this, and I find it kind of twisted that last night I had to give a lecture about the legislative process. And then this happens. I mean, if that's not irony, since I teach state government, right? And I just, I came out of the classroom like reading y'all's emails like, oh my goodness, no. And obviously your article too, Mark. I was just like, oh no. So it just seems to never end. And, but how unusual that they're going to have two separate chambers passing their own version. I just am like, what? Because they can't break the tie in the Senate? I'm befuddled. I wish I had a better answer for this.
It seems it's all fear-based, and the Republicans have made this the line in the sand that everybody's supposed to fear is the notion of tolling and another tax. And now they've scared enough Democrats into it that it's just common sense has kind of gone by the wayside, and it's this toll and this breaking up the bill so that no one has to be out in front and taking the lead in this. It's just so preposterous.
But it's perfect time because it's an election year, right, Dave?
Right, of course. Yeah.
Well, and if anybody's not closely following it, so the overall plan is to have 12 tolling gantries for tractor trailers on 12 bridges on Connecticut highways. And the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats, they don't trust each other. Do you really have the votes to go forward? So they're talking about doing two bills, each with 6, and then there'll be an exchange of hostages after one chamber passes it, which, obviously it invites, rightly so, quite a bit of ridicule. And the Republicans are furious, saying, if you're going to go through these machinations, we're going to keep you there overnight into the next day and God knows how long. And it does. So the question is, why has this issue become so fraught with fear, and why is it so controversial? And that is, I think, the interesting, the bigger question. Are we at some kind of a tipping point where small things can become huge? Now, certainly the governor bears some responsibility for horribly mishandling this. There was a rollout of a proposal a year ago that was, incredibly mishandled. But it was for 50 tolling gantries, and they really weren't prepared to explain what the state of Connecticut's going to get for this imposition of tolls. So the opponents really controlled the field, including the Republicans. But there was also a grassroots group that has done a phenomenal job. And so this has been baked into what is this huge thing, almost like the passage of the income tax in 1991, which I covered. And it's amazing that these two things seem to be on the same footing, because the bill before the legislature right now is quite modest. Again, it's tractor-trailer tolls. There's a question of the legality. Will they hold up? I mean, there's a lot of legitimate public policy questions to raise about this. But as far as what it means for all of us, the idea that it's this controversial is really amazing, that the legislature would put itself through these machinations.
It seems like legislative gymnastics that they're doing here. So as you described here, they're dividing up the bill into two sections, and one chamber passes half of it, and the other chamber passes half of it, and then they switch them back and forth. Is that sort of the?
Well, it's two bills, and each bill would have to pass both chambers. A week ago, they had even a stranger idea of having identical bills, and you do them at the same time. But one of the bills would have to pass the other chamber. But the idea was you just wanted to get both chambers on record in favor of the same thing, and then one of the other chambers would have to, vote twice on it, essentially, and all to reassure God knows how many people that this is going to be final passage. I understand when something is super controversial, there are legislators who will say, look, if I'm going to take heat for this, I want it to be because it's actually going to happen. We saw that in the income tax. You had people who said, look, if you really have the votes in the other chamber, I will do it. And they did. But they didn't go through this process. The Senate voted for the income tax at 3 a.m. It went to the House, and it actually failed initially, and they had to.
But Mark, to be fair, was there a lot of delay at that time in the 19? I was in Connecticut then, but I don't remember the timeline. I mean, did it take this long to really?
Well,
pass?
You can't really compare that because
Right?
it took that long, but for other reasons. The legislature passed 3 what we would consider conventional budgets, non-income tax budgets. Governor Weicker said each of those budgets were fraudulent, that they weren't going to hold up, that they papered over the numbers, and that they would fall apart very quickly. So, yes, it stretched it out because there were 3 budgets that were vetoed. So it was in August, the end of August, that the income tax was passed. And then the fight continued. There was an effort to repeal after this massive protest. And then when that failed, there was an effort to revise the income tax, and that failed. So that debate, when you look at all of it, really continued almost until the week before Christmas.
I mean, I can't help but think that this is the Republicans must be so gleeful this morning with this crazy pretzel that the Democrats have put themselves in to try to pass this. And again, it's their hobby horse, and they're rocking it really, really well. It's the notion that this is another tax and that the Democrats are taxing you some more. And even when you look down and you drill down, you look at the actual bill, it prohibits tolling on cars for 10 years. It's trucks. It's mostly out-of-state trucks, but they've convinced people that this is a new tax, and soon if they don't do this, they'll be taxing something else, and it's just they've used it so effectively, and it's such another good example of where the governor hasn't been able to use his majority in the legislature to get a simple
or
thing
be an
like
effective
this done.
leader and take charge of it and
Right.
own up to it.
Right.
I mean, I probably sent a tense tweet last night about it, quite frankly, because it's like either S word or get off the pot.
Right.
It's like, come on,
Right.
take it and own it. And obviously, as you're saying, David, one of the monikers has been pushed by the people at the grassroots is that, if you vote for tolls, you lose at the polls. This has been emphasized over and over again,
Right.
and this is an election year. So the further you kick this down the road,
It's scaring
the
those
worse it
Democrats
gets.
too, as best
Absolutely.
they can.
So, Professor Wharton, as the one who was teaching a legislative process last night, so if you were in the governor's shoes and you're looking forward and trying to get this thing done and trying to get something, I mean, really, nobody wants to pay tolls.
No.
How do you actually get the lawmakers to go along with this and actually approve this, something like this?
I often wonder, especially in light of my columns in the past for the Connecticut News Junkie, beyond the governor, what is going on in Martin Looney's office in the sense of what's the game plan here? And I don't want to put it all on the governor, although it's easy to. I often wonder, pointing the finger back at somebody like a majority leader who's been in the General Assembly since 1980, mind you. What is going on there with the majority? Because clearly there's been issues even within its caucus.
At this point, this is a failure of legislative leadership. Let's be absolutely blunt about this. That's not to say the governor doesn't bear great responsibility for how he allowed the opposition really to dominate this. So again, he owns that totally.
If I could evoke the memory of our former governor, Daniel Malloy, when he rolled out what he knew was going to be unpopular taxes to try to pull the state out of a financial crisis, he went around, and I saw him in New London. He went all across the state. He held forums that people got up. There were microphones. They could confront him. They could talk about it. He had something to sell, and he had you look back on it, maybe it wasn't. We shouldn't have bought it, but he sold it and he defended it, and he pushed hard to make it pass. And I don't see that any kind of effort like that from Governor Lamont.
Okay, thank you, David. So you get the final word on that. And coming up after the break, David Collins covers the waterfront and State Pier in New London. This is the Wheelhouse.
The Port Authority is not a private institution. It is a quasi. The legislature should have a role.
I wanted to make sure we didn't just build it so that it would be great for wind power for the next 10 years, but that New London was going to be a world-class port for the next 100 years.
As we know, the indiscretions of the Port Authority are still relatively fresh in all of our minds.
This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Matt Dwyer, filling in for Lucy Nalpathanchil, who is sick. Get well soon, Lucy. You can join the conversation. Find us on Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Our guests today are Jonathan Wharton, Associate Professor of Political Science at Southern Connecticut State University. You can tweet him at PreppyProf. David Collins, columnist at The Day. Tweet him at David Collins CT. And Mark Pasniokis, Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. He's at CT Mirror Paz. So, David, I guess we'll sort of go to you first on this, our next topic here on the quasi-publics and the state pier. So there's about $150 million worth of work that's planned for state pier. So what do you get for $150 million for a pier?
Well, you get a big platform for a Danish wind company to begin its offshore wind development, and you get a big blank check from Governor Lamont. This was the governor who was going on a debt diet, and now he's signed this deal. He's organized this deal through the quasi. He kind of seized the quasi, put together this deal. As of the summer, it was a $93 million deal. Now it's $157 million, and the state is going to cover all the cost overruns to turn State Pier in New London into this staging area for offshore wind.
So this will be overseen by the Connecticut Port Authority, which is a quasi-public agency, right?
That's right. Although, really, ever since the scandals began to unfold surrounding the Port Authority this summer, the governor has pretty much taken it over, and this is his work. And so even the notion of the legislature kind of reining in the quasis and passing these new bills that would regulate salaries and things like that, he's just seized this and taken it over. The board has many vacancies. He's using the votes of his commissioners to pass these things. There's no executive director. He just kind of took it over, and this is his deal that came as a result of it. And it's just sort of a classic, here's a wind company that needs this pier and needs this facility, and we'll just throw in tens of millions of dollars in state money to help you do it when this is something they need and want, and they should pay taxes on. They should be paying taxes to the city of New London on it too. And that's a problem that's still unresolved. Even though the governor has declared a win and the completion of this deal, the poor mayor of New London is still trying to sign some kind of a host agreement so he'll get something back for the city of New London.
And the reason that we're doing all this ultimately is to improve that pier so that it can be sort of a launching pad for these giant wind turbines that'll be put in place offshore, right?
That's right. That's the ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal is good. However, the governor, in promising all this money and covering all these cost overruns and this total remake of the pier, he ignores the fact, he pretends as if he seems to think this is the only wind port in North America. In fact, this is happening all up and down the East Coast, and states are making these kinds of investments, and certainly they're appropriate as we try to find new carbon-free energy sources, and it's certainly something that the state needs to be involved in and promote. But he said New London will become the Saudi Arabia of wind. Which how frightening is that? This is our governor, and of course they're not. This is developing all up and down the East Coast, and America's catching up to the European wind model. But he took this on. He's taken the responsibility for this enormous incentive for this Danish wind company.
And the authority and the governor will have sort of a key role in overseeing the pier development and the pier. And you alluded to some of the problems that the authority has had. I believe there were some issues with some artwork, right?
Yes. Well, he kind of conveniently, in a way, the scandals that surrounded the Port Authority that kind of unfolded this summer, they were, giving themselves lavish expense accounts and lunches and trips, and buying artwork from ultimately the chairman of the board, and so it actually was kind of a convenient excuse for the governor to move it and say this is just unacceptable, and I'm going to take over this, and clean up this agency. But he hasn't really cleaned it up. He made this deal, and the other troubling thing is that they've just just run roughshod over freedom of information laws, and there's many cases, many of mine and other cases pending before the Freedom of Information Commission. He's done so much of this in secret, and he's done it all to accommodate this wind company. He's closed the pier to traditional port cargoes. They're moving away fishermen that were based there. They're no longer going to be able to bring road salt in for the region's roads. So it's actually probably the most effective thing he's done as governor. He's taken this on and done this really on his own and kind of rolled right over the quasi.
And the executive director of the Port Authority left last year. Was it ever kind of learned kind of why that happened? Or
they said there was a hearing on the problems at the Port Authority, and the interim chairman said that he was placed on leave because of something he said to me, actually, in a column about a critic of the Port Authority, and he made these remarks about him, and they said that's why he was let go. But I'm not. I think again the governor has moved in and taken over the agency, and it was sort of a convenient thing that they were able to do that, and it now no longer has an effective board, but it doesn't even have an executive director.
And do you think that the issues that have cropped up at the Port Authority say something kind of bigger about similar quasi-public agencies around the state? Do you think they're any more likely to have these sorts of problems, or are they any more troublesome than regular state agencies?
Yeah, I'm afraid that the discussion about the quasis has kind of gone off track a little bit. I mean, they point to all the problems at the Port Authority, and they say, oh, the quasis, there's this corruption, and we have to rein them in, and we have to have new laws to change them. And ultimately, I'm not sure that the laws that are being proposed, the quasi ignored all the laws anyway, the Port Authority, so many of the laws. And so I'm not sure that new laws are the solution. And I'm not sure, I think there should be a bigger discussion about how much of this business of the state should be pushed off onto these quasis, and how much should stay within state government and all of its checks and balances and controls. And I think that's the bigger discussion that really should be had, rather than sort of trying to put more rules on each of the quasis.
And there's a lot of issues right now with the Connecticut lottery, and the Connecticut lottery is a huge revenue producer for the state of Connecticut. But there have been all kinds of questions about management there. Now there's a new CEO, and he's trying to sort of right the ship. There's that, and the lottery has always been resistant to the idea of how much of their work is public. When they pushed Keno, I tried to find out what kind of market studies they had that would indicate, is this going to create new gamblers? Is this going to cut into existing business? And they insisted they had nothing, which I found really bizarre if you're going to do that. On the other hand, the Capital Region Development Authority, I think, has been highly successful in the Hartford area as far as taking public money and leveraging a lot of private investment in a city at a time when millennials and employers all say Connecticut's economic growth really relies in part on making Connecticut's smallish cities more attractive to the next generation of workers. So it's a hard thing. How do you make these things work? Some people who go on these quasi-public boards are under the misimpression that they are exempt from a lot of the controls that we see for state agencies, particularly public information. Mm-hmm. They are not exempt. This is not a license to do the people's business in private. Even when they acknowledge, for instance, with the Connecticut Port Authority, they acknowledge that they're subject to freedom of information laws, but then they fight it. And so in a way that the state government agencies really wouldn't have the temerity to do. They hire these $400, $500 an hour lawyers, and they go to the commission and they string it out and they fight it. And it's just even when they acknowledge it, they're not abiding by these kinds of laws, and that's why I think that's so.
How much of this is this almost a reminder of the Kelo case? Since you have this taking place, as you said, a lot of the corporate welfare and some of the exemptions and concerns surrounding this in terms of openness and fairness too.
And that being the London Development Authority seeking to seek homes.
My newspaper had to fight for the disclosure.
Absolutely,
that was a long battle.
Exactly.
And what is classic about that fight is, and this is where I'm slightly sympathetic to the quasis, they are in a position that a lot of state agencies are not, and that they're doing business. They're doing business deals. And in doing that, you take possession of proprietary information. And that's where this stuff gets tricky. And it doesn't mean they should be let off the hook, because I think they go to that exemption far too quickly.
I have a case pending right now before the Freedom of Information Commission, and they are challenging the release of the legal bills for the agency, and there are hundreds of pages, $1 million that they paid to Hartford law firm, and the Hartford law firm redacted them all, and almost the original redactions, there was barely anything left that wasn't blacked out, and really the law is very clear that they can't do this, and yet. The last hearing I had, they had 3 lawyers making $500 an hour to fight this and to keep the people of Connecticut to find out what they paid for. So I understand there's certain instances, but those proprietary information that those companies might disclose to a quasi, that's protected under Freedom of Information laws anyway. Whether it's
no,
a state
absolutely,
government or,
and I agree with Dave that this is the example of how they take a legitimate exemption and extend it. What is the rationale for protecting, legal bills? They're going to claim that it probably would disclose something about legal strategy, but that I think we'd all agree that's a bit of a stretch.
And what does this mean for the future for additional cities? See, I'm keep on thinking about this down the road in terms of setting precedents, because I'm concerned for development projects throughout Connecticut. As you said earlier, this is a big issue for, certainly I would imagine the development director like Lehman and others who want to see cities, thrive, bring in younger people. And we need this desperately in Connecticut cities. It frustrates me.
Well, the governor is proposing another quasi to do just that, to link transit with new kinds of housing and great concept. But once again, I wonder, is that something that should be done in this atmosphere where there's not the accountability that you have from government, and when you're spending all that government money, and even the legislatures don't have the sort of kind of clout that they do with a state agency that's misbehaving or doing the wrong thing. I mean, it's this once removed, this quasi.
Okay, and you get the final word on that, David. So we'll move on next to Jonathan, who had written earlier about the plight of the congressional Republican in New England and what happened to those folks. So I guess Maine Senator Susan Collins being the only Republican left in the U.S. House or Senate from New England. So what happened to those folks?
Well, so that was actually dealing with the day's editorial, which I was kind of struck by reading it. And I got a lot of response about that, putting it out there on Twitter, because there's been a concern or maybe misinformation that, the Republican Party is purely just the national party. So I thought, honestly, Dave, the editorial board put together, a credible editorial. I was just kind of curious as to what sparked it. Maybe it was Susan Collins in terms of what's going on with the national party in the effort of recruiting more or finding a way to find viable candidates to win, not just in Connecticut, but just in New England in general, writ large. But I thought that the most poignant part was the reality that I think the media tends to overlook. At the state and local level, it's not like this in terms of what's taking place in the national party. I have emphasized this over and over again to my students and to so many other people who seem to frame that what's going on in the state and local level is the same thing going on at the national when they're not. And so I was pleased to see that line in there and emphasizing the kind of reality.
I agree with that, and certainly the performance or the Republican Party in Connecticut is a different animal than nationally, I think, and they're able to make traction on things like tolls and make their arguments about good government that separates them from the national issues that divide Democrats and Republicans. But I do think that the shrinking of the Republican presence in the national delegation is sort of an example of the way that moderates have been sort of pushed aside in general in the Republican Party. And I think probably Connecticut, although it's happened over a longer period of time, is sort of a good example of how that's come to be.
Although I will tell you that I don't think I'll put myself in that camp. I don't think many of us have gone away. We are somewhere in the shadows. And I even see this going to State Central dinner since I'm on, State Central for the Republican Party. And I'll admit freely, we tend to kind of caucus together in corners here and there. And actually, we even sit together, even afterwards. Most of the people, by the way, which your editorial hit on, are actually from the shoreline that I tend to meet up and talk with, who are people from Lyme and Essex. And so some of those towns that are near New London that the editorial spoke towards.
Well, let's just say it. I mean, the biggest problem the Connecticut Republicans have, it's not the Democrats. It's not the imbalance in the voter registration. It's the National Republican Party.
I won't dispute that.
It's how dominant Donald Trump has become. He owns this party, and there is this great divide between what plays nationally and what plays here. So you're absolutely right. The Connecticut Republicans in the General Assembly were on an incredible winning streak.
Yeah.
They had a bad election night in 2008. Barack Obama's coattails really helped Republicans. But
even Chris Shays obviously got voted out then.
Absolutely,
My former boss.
But not just Chris Shays.
Thanks, Obama.
In the General Assembly.
Right.
He was the last presidential election that really affected the General Assembly. And what we saw since then is Republicans picked up seats in every cycle except one where they held their own in the 2012 presidential year. Despite losing at the top of the ticket. So that showed that Connecticut voters were really interested in having a counterbalance to the Democrats when it came to state legislature. But that all went to hell in 2018. In reaction to the election of President Trump, the Democratic base became incredibly energized. There were 200,000 more voters who turned out in 2018 that had generally turned out. We went from 1.1 million people to 1.3 million. And that's been a problem for the Republican Party. And I don't know what the answer is, but you see it at the national convention.
I think you're absolutely right. And the answer for them is tolls. No tolls. Don't talk about Donald Trump, but no tolls.
So Jonathan, on a similar topic that you did write about, really,
Yes.
I promise, the population of the state's three biggest cities are majority, minority, Black and Hispanic. They're all led by white mayors right now. So is part of your argument that that's basically because they're the Democratic Party leaders in those cities tend to be white, so they tend to favor white
I
candidates?
stress that in my Connecticut News Junkie piece because it's that and also the internal workings of the Democratic town committees in those three cities, in Bridgeport, Hartford, and New Haven. And speaking towards what Mark had just offered, a lot of these new voters are in fact unaffiliated voters. And so many of them are newly arriving transplants. They may be Black, white, Latino. But how are they picking up support within the Democratic Party locally? Too often, a lot of those decisions are decided by the DTCs. And as a former Republican chairman in New Haven, I've been the face of confronting them often about it. Sometimes they don't even know where the meetings are. They're not consistent on that. So they operate a very different ship than one would imagine. But yes, I am concerned, and most people have been, because Daniel Tamari put together a good piece back in November about this as an issue. Where is the future of the party going if they're not going to be nearly as inclusive or considered bringing in more minority officials, especially at the mayoral seat?
Are 3 data points enough to really make that argument?
I think so, because it's 3 key large cities where it's overwhelmingly Black and Latino.
A Black woman, Marilyn Monroe, ran what is widely considered to be an ineffectual campaign, and she beat Joe Ganim and the machine at the polls. It was only the absentee ballots. So
wasn't that fascinating?
Yeah, and the history is also a little bit different. I mean, in Hartford's case, in the last 30 years, there have been 6 mayors: 2 Black mayors, 2 white mayors, 2 Puerto Rican mayors. So.
But not sustainable. They haven't stayed for that long. They're lucky to stay for a term 2
well,
tops.
in the case of Eddie Perez, it was because he was charged with a crime.
Correct.
I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, it's certainly interesting that we had 3 white mayors elected for these 3. Yeah. But again, I covered Hartford for a long time, and it's just so nuanced. They've had Black town chairs. There are times that the town committee has been very effective. Bridgeport's this whole other thing.
It really is.
New London has a white mayor too, and a large Black population. But I think probably there's a predominantly Black city council now, and they've been, and that's more recent. And so I think. I don't know. I kind of agree with Mark. I think it's hard to pick out 3 cities and say, "Oh, those are all white mayors." And
so, gentlemen, I actually research and write a lot about coalition building politics, and I'm not just picking out the mayoral office. I mean, you're right to bring out the council, but effectively, what's going on at the ground level with the town committee? And I'm speaking, specifically towards the Democratic town committee, because when you have a monopoly in a city like this, it prevents a number of people from being politically incorporated.
In a little city like New London, hard to imagine a almost Black city council without that kind of level of
Even in
participation.
Bridgeport,
at the
too.
Democratic Council,
Even in
right?
Bridgeport, Connecticut's largest city. So,
And the voter registration trend, it's still, you're right. Younger people are doing unaffiliated, although the statistics have certainly shown since Trump, the Democrats have done quite well with new registrations.
leaning Democrat, yes,
And,
who are unaffiliated, yeah.
and in the three cities, Democrats still outnumber unaffiliateds by more than 2-1, and Republicans we don't even have to talk about because it's
course not.
basically rounding error.
But if you notice the turnout, you're lucky to get somewhere in the teens
Yeah.
in terms of voter, right? And for the primaries, you're lucky to get 20%. And we saw that certainly last time around in some of these cities, including in New Haven. The turnout was actually over 30%, which shocked people in the primary.
Yeah.
So it is interesting in terms of what are you doing to get out the vote, even among the base, when they're not being nearly as inclusive as they could or should be.
And the other factor is, like in Hartford, the coalition building is out. It's also outside the Democratic Party. The three minority representation seats. When I say minority, I'm talking political minority.
Exactly.
Because Hartford has at-large representation, and you can only hold one party can only hold 2/3 of those seats. So you have the working families, which have elected a pretty diverse group of folks, and that's part of the dynamic. Again, Bridgeport, a whole nother thing. Although working families, they elected a state senator.
They're making some inroads there.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, I mean, is sort of like some of the social challenges that Black and Latino potential candidates face, is that maybe part of what's dragging them down if they don't have,
That's
the
what
money
I'm curious to find out. I mean, what is it, institutionally at least, are you seeing taking place within maybe the town committee, the Democrats at least? Are they getting that kind of support? I guess I was really struck by what happened with Toni Harp. I mean, I'm not saying that she's a formidable candidate in many ways, but the support system wasn't quite there from the Democratic chairman. And so I was a little bit taken back by that early on. And of course, you saw the same thing taking place in Hartford and even especially in Bridgeport, right? Of course, everybody knows about Tessa, and that's a whole other story going back to Bridgeport. But I guess I'm kind of amazed by what is going to take place the next time around. It's interesting because I think the seeds could be planted for the next time around in terms of who the mayoral candidates could be.
Okay, so I think we need to take a break here. So you get the last word on that, Jonathan. After the break, there will be a Republican presidential primary in Connecticut. Not everyone is happy about it. This is the Wheelhouse. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Matt Dwyer, filling in for Lucy Nalpathanchil, who is sick today. Connecticut Republican Party Chairman J.R. Romano takes issue with Democratic Secretary of State Denise Merrill's decision to order a Republican presidential primary in Connecticut.
This is a purely political decision. She has no rhyme or reason to justify the primary. And frankly, it's going to cost towns money, right? This whole process is going to cost towns money within their budget that they were not expecting.
Merrill decided that Bill Weld and Rocky De La Fuente both have enough recognition to be on the ballot without collecting signatures. You can join the conversation on Twitter at WNPR Wheelhouse. Our guests, David Collins, columnist at The Day, at David Collins Connecticut, Mark Pazniokas, Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror, at CT Mirror Paz, and Jonathan Morton, Associate Professor of Political Science at Southern Connecticut State University, at Preppy Prof. At Preppy Prof, does this make a difference actually for Donald Trump?
I think it's causing some rancor, obviously, since you included JR's quote in there, because there's a concern about how far can the Secretary of State go on this. Look, I will stand with my chairman on this as an issue because not only is it costly, it's highly unusual that this kind of thing would happen where they're not nearly as inclusive as they could be with the Republican Party leaders.
And Mark, so I guess what kind of is the standard for actually deciding who gets to be on the presidential primary ballot without having to collect signatures?
The standard is an incredibly low bar. It's basically if you're getting any attention in the state and national press, that's the basis to get on the ballot. In some states, it's you just buy your way on. In New Hampshire, that's the deal. You pay a $1,000 fee, you're on. And they have they'll have dozens and dozens of candidates on the ballots. So if there had been a Republican Secretary of State right now who said Bill Weld, you are denied a primary in Connecticut, I think all hell would have broken loose. So I think Merrill was damned if she did, damned if she didn't. I'll hold comment on Rocky De La Fuente. But I think he clearly got in her head. This is a gentleman who ran for president 4 years ago as a Democrat. He petitioned his way on the Connecticut ballot. He sued other states that denied him ballot access. He sued Connecticut over a state requirement that when you circulate petitions, you must only use state residents, and he won in court. So I think Secretary Merrill decided she did not want to tangle with Rocky. The question of William Weld.
Don't want to go 2 rounds with Rocky.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the question of cost, yes, it will cost. But you know what? That's not part of the standard in the law. There's nothing in the law that addresses cost, nor, quite frankly, that addresses viability. So, the Republicans, JR he's looking at challenging state laws in a broader sense. His view is state law should not dictate how the parties decide to nominate. If they want to do runoff elections, if they want to do caucuses, if they want to do whatever, it should be up to them. The problem with that is nominating people for the major parties is this hybrid. It involves the states. It involves elections. It has since the era of the primaries. Prior to the primaries, really, which only go back to like 1970 in Connecticut, the parties really, it was up to them. They had conventions, and that was the deal. But that's no longer the deal. So I don't know what the sweet spot is between state law dictating how the parties, what the framework is for the parties to nominate or not.
Okay, and with that, I guess we'll move on to feats of.
I think Chairman Romano could find a better fight to pick. That's my sense.
Okay,
he's always up for picking a fight. Though.
All right, feats of strength, airing of grievances. That's it. So Jonathan, what do you have for us?
Well, speaking
today?
of picking a fight, I am fascinated. Discussing about earlier Majority Senate Leader. Martin Looney's election, because he's getting competition from both left and right. I think you all saw that New Haven Independent article with Alex Thomas running, as well as Jameson White. So he's getting it from both sides. So I'm really interested in seeing how that's going to play out. So to me, I'm fascinated by that.
Mark?
Feat of strength, a guy named Carl Butz, B-U-T-Z. He's my new hero. He bought the Mountain Messenger in California to keep this weekly paper going. And the headline when he decided to take over the paper, that the guy who was selling it to him or giving it to him, the headline was "Pigeon Found, the Messenger to Continue." So good luck to Mr. Butz and keeping the messenger alive.
And David?
Grievance. I can't say enough good things. Actually, a little bit of both. I can't say enough good things about the heroes at the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission. They do such great work, but they are so underfunded and understaffed. And I can't help but think I go to the DOT headquarters, and it's this vast city of people, and we haven't built a highway in 20 years in Connecticut, and a little bit of all of that money that goes to so many other state bureaucracies get pushed a little bit toward the Freedom of Information Commission. It's so important, and they do such great work.
All right, and I would like to plug the Connecticut Public documentary, Fake, Searching for Truth in the Age of Misinformation. Watch it. Today's episode was produced, by me. Kat Pastor is the technical producer. Get better, Lucy!